Okay, it is my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the FeBo team to our 16th FeBinar, the talks organized as part of our Year C FeBo project. FeBo is funded by the European Research Council and hosted by the Department of Humanities at the University of Trento. Our goal is to analyze the relevance of borders for federal states in antiquity, but also from a comparative perspective with modernity. Did the Greek koina have borders? Intrafederal, internal borders, interfederal, external borders. Were they linear borders or more border zones? Did the koina have a capacity to implement strategies to manage such boundaries? Did they have a capacity to implement strategies in order to defend the autonomy? Or was it more a matter of political culture, of boundary management? Was border management a means to defend autonomy? You can find everything on our ERC website and on the University of Trento's YouTube channel, where there are recordings of all the FeBinars, of the past FeBinars. FeBinars are our think tanks. We have built a virtual lab in the framework of which we work on federalism and border management, and we periodically invite an external expert to our lab to exchange ideas with us and to present us with cases by offering his expertise. As I said before, intrafederal borders and interfederal borders, we are aware that they cannot always be distinguished, that the former can easily become the latter and the other way around, of course, but for pure reasons of defining a research path, we distinguished two distinct series of lectures, each with another focus, one on internal borders, that is the management of internal borders by federal states, and the other on external borders, crossing federal borders, ancient and modern. This FeBinar is the 9th one of the FeBinar series, the management of internal borders by federal states, focusing on internal border areas of ancient Greek federal states. It will address a famous inscription preserving details of the border of Ambrakia and Charadros sometime in the early 60s of the 2nd century BC, and will delve into issues such as border negotiation and autonomy of Greek states, cities, as well as koina, in historical phases in which new players shift the balance of power in central Greece too. We are really excited to hear from Jeremy McInerney because these are research issues that we continue to debate in our internal workshops. Is border management triggered by the need to cope with new actors? And so does it fit into the broader and equally complex discourse of the tension between autonomy and interstate alliances that Professor Berzot told us about last week? And if so, can it become an opportunity to defend its autonomy and help define a balance of powers? Back to our FeBinar and our guest today. Professor McInerney does not need a presentation, of course, but as usual, I'm sharing with the younger students the highlights of his long career. He's Davidson Kennedy Associate Professor of Classical Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, where he has been for over 30 years by now, and where he's also co-director of the faculty. He got a PhD in ancient history and Mediterranean archaeology at the University of California, Berkeley. And among his numerous research interests, I'd like to draw your attention on some seminal articles and books. He explored network theory as a way of understanding the development and role of sanctuaries in the regional settings, a seminal article important to our studies here in FeBo too, and devoted a wonderful book to one of my favorite topics, the Phocians, the Falls of Parnassus, Land and Ethnicity in Ancient Phocis, Texas University Press. 1999, as well as a study of cattle in the Greek world, another very important book. And he also edited a companion to another very important issue to FeBo, that is ethnicity. It is the companion to ethnicity in the ancient Mediterranean, Blackwell. He wrote the chapter devoted to the Phocians in the so-called New Larsen, that is Beck Funke 2015, Federalism in Greek Antiquity, and another challenging chapter to the role of Iampolis and the sanctuary of Calapodi in the recent volume edited by Katja Sporn and Eric Laufer. And this chapter is also devoted more generally to some dynamics in focus. Today, he will share with us a very intriguing case of border negotiation. The border between Ambrakia and Charadros, negotiating survival in the shadow of Rome. So it's time to leave the floor to Professor McInerney. I am really delighted that he accepted our invitation to give a FeBinar for us. Thank you very much.
That's lovely, Elena. Thank you. Can everyone hear me clearly?
Yes?
Yes? Okay, good. Okay, I'll crack on. First of all, I want to say thank you very much to Elena and Claudio and the rest of the FeBo team, not just for this invitation, but I've had the opportunity to sit in on a number of other presentations, and they're really transformative. They're just fantastic. So I'm very honored to be a part of this. On a more simple note, the inscription today is a lengthy one, and I sent a PDF, both of the text and another PDF of the translation, so hopefully you've all received that through email. If not, don't despair, because most of the relevant sections will be on the slides coming up today. And the third thing before I get properly started is I want to say this is genuinely work in progress. I presented an earlier version of this at the beginning of this year at Angelos Haniotis Epigraphy Day up at the Institute for Advanced Study. And as a result of that, I received some incredibly useful feedback, particularly from Sven Gunther and Julian Schneider, who I see is actually here today. So I wanted to say thank you very much to those that have helped. And please, I urge you, if you have suggestions that we don't get to in the Q&A at the end today, I would really appreciate it if you sent your comments to me, because this has proved to be extraordinarily helpful previously. So today I want to discuss with you an inscription that preserves the details of a border agreement between two towns close to the Gulf of Ambrakia in Western Greece. This was published as SEG 35 665. And it's an inscription that was first published by Pierre Caban and Ioana Andreou in the BCH in 1985. Shortly after its publication, Christian Habicht published a short note establishing that the inscription could be dated on prosopographical grounds to the tumultuous period after the Third Macedonian War and the defeat of Perseus in 168. Subsequently, the inscription was further commented on in detail by Chaneur and Treur in 1988, and since then various scholars interested in treaties in general, such as Giovanna Daverio Rocchi and Sheila Eger, have included the inscription in their dossiers of Hellenistic inscriptions, while a succession of scholars, Musti, Salviar, Carazzeni most notably, have attempted to clarify the topography of the inscription, clearly a matter of some importance if we're to know specifically what terrain is being defined and how jurisdiction is being determined. In today's discussion, I propose to touch on these topographical details before moving to the anomalous features that I think are truly important for understanding the inscription's full significance. I begin with some notes and observations regarding topography, and I'll have to ask your indulgence because this is somewhat detailed and potentially tedious. But if you'll indulge me, I think you'll find that the result is an inscription that looks sheds a great deal of light on the impact of Rome. From the point of view of the issues explored in this FeBo series, the argument I propose is this. The mechanisms of Greek international arbitration were not well suited for coping with asymmetrical power relations. Local practices, when scaled up to deal with an international superpower located far away and essentially uninvested in Greek practices of land arbitration, were poorly equipped to guarantee mediation or to settle disputes when Rome was involved. The Romans had their own well-established practices when it came to arbitrating land disputes, and Roman arbitration was an uncomfortable fit with Greek judicial procedures. Nevertheless, local agreements could serve a hortatory function, instantiating, emphasizing, and affirming the capacities and rights of local communities in the face of hegemonial power. In short, I hope to show this border settlement illustrates how little communities try to compensate for their vulnerability by adapting the legal procedures favored by Rome. In the end, what they create is a kind of hybrid, blending Greek border settlements with Roman judicial practice. In the first place, the preamble of the inscription makes clear that we are dealing with a public decree involving two independent communities, Ambrakia and Charadros. Ambrakia is modern Arta. The location of Charadros is disputed. Both communities are named explicitly, and magistrates from the two polis are cited in the dating formula. When Diophanes, son of Dimachus, was secretary at Ambrakia, and Menandros, son of Metrophanes, was citiarchon at Charadros, in the month of Phoenikaios, according to both their calendars, they made this covenant and treaty of agreement, as was resolved by the council and assembly of Ambrakia, and also resolved by the council and assembly of Charadros. And the expression tarda sunethanta kai epoiesanta, homologa sumbola, conveys exactly what the two states were fashioning, an agreed upon settlement. Approximately 25 delegates from Ambrakia and 10 from Charadros are named, probably indicative of the relative size of the two communities. In some respects, the boundary inscription reflects the familiar conventions of Hellenistic adjudications. For example, after the dating formula, the formalities begin so that the borders between the territory of Ambrakia and Charadros may be defined, hekaterai hypoles equinan. This is very similar to a border adjudication from Delphi from 214 to 213 BC that specifies a set of dicastai chosen from the Aetolians, and also opens with the formula, let this be the border between the Xiniaioi and the Melitaies of the lands which the Melitaies guided the judges around. So far, so good. But at this point, the definition of the border diverges significantly from the norm. The Delphi inscription, following conventional practice, offers what Daverio Rocchi calls a linear border, from the temple of Boras by way of the valley at the source of the Kephisos, from the spring in the grove by Strabaya, from the grove along the wagon road, and so forth. In her collection, Daverio Rocchi has 11 such confini lineari, and certain features are common to all such agreements: mountains, peaks, ravines, conspicuous markers in the landscape, sometimes sanctuaries or other made features provide the markers, and where water courses are involved, the two parties often agree to share the water. But a second type of boundary can also be found within a territory. Examining the boundary markers in Argive territory, Clémence Weber-Palais, who has spoken in this series, has demonstrated that the boundary markers discovered in the territory of Argos delimit primarily sanctuaries or sacred lands belonging to such and such a divinity, as well as different intra-urban institutions such as tribal places or possessions. And she's concluded no boundary marker delimiting the civic territory has up to the present been discovered. So the mention of borders may look very different depending on what exactly is being delineated. The agreement between Ambrakia and Charadros actually represents a third type of border definition. rather than simply proceeding by stages from one prominent natural feature to another, and without concerning itself with sacred land, the border is laid out using linear measurements of a fixed length proceeding from walls, usually culminating in a border marker called not a horos, but a termon. The settlement also makes reference to a third party, Orion. Reading Andrew Smith's translation, which follows Caban and Andreu's text, we have the terms were as follows, so the borders between the territory of Ambrakia and Charadros may be defined. Both the cities have decided, after measuring a plethron from the first corner of the wall of Ambrakia to ... of Heraclea in the region by Orion, and placing a boundary marker there. From this boundary marker in the valley of the river Aphas by Orion, and again from the other angle at the top of the wall, after measuring a plethron, to the region by Orion along the wall, and placing a boundary marker there. And from this boundary marker straight ahead to the top of the mountain called Kalla, and placing a boundary marker at the top. After measuring however many stages this is distant from the wall of the city of Ambrakia by the most direct route, and from this boundary marker measuring ... as the water divides until the border between the Oraites and the Ambraciots and Ostrion. If this doesn't sound grammatically correct, it's obviously because I'm reading straight through where there are breaks and lacunae. But please note that the detail according to which the plethron is measured from the wall of Ambrakia is reconstructed. It's a plethron, and it's measured from a wall, but which wall is a guess. At this point, it's helpful to identify the known locations which anchor the topographic discussion. Ambrakia, as you can see on this map, is located on the site of modern Arta in the southeastern part of the map I'm showing you. And Orion is securely identified as Amotopos at the very top of the map, approximately 18 kilometers away from Arta. Although the locations of Heracleion and Oistrion are less secure, we can broadly determine that the border between Ambrakia and Orion is located north of Arta, heading towards the narrow defile coming from Pentapigadi. I'm not sure whether you can see my cursor on the screen, but the area of Pentapigadi is round here. For easy point of reference, it's marked as 5 on the map. That is to say, it's Route 5, but it's also Pentapigadi. All right, it's towards the narrow defile from Pentapigadi, where the fertile land of the Arta plain begins. All right, so the fertile land begins here, and as you can see after this triangular section, it broadly defines this plain here. This is the broad and fertile plain of Arta. That said, commentators have had difficulty in making sense of the survey lines thought to have been measured from the walls of the city of Ambrakia, the walls we have, as you can see here. One plethron, or 100 feet from the city wall, basically places you here in this narrow strip of land that lies between the city walls and the Arachthos River. It's an unlikely spot for fixing the border. The solution lies in the brilliant realization by Vivi Carazzeni that the measurements were not from the city of Ambrakia, incorrectly restored in line 16, but from a spot called Heraclea, also mentioned in line 23, and identified also with a Heracleion Frurion in line 27. These, she suggested, corresponded to the springs at Lutra, also known as Piges Chanopoulou, where in fact traces of a tower were found at a point where the fertile Arta plain neatly divides into a northern half, now assigned to Orion, and a southern half falling within the orbit of Ambrakia. Accordingly, the updated text of the inscription dealing with the measuring of a plethron, sorry, I passed over this slide too quickly. Let me just explain to you. So Arta is towards the southern end of the picture. Oreon, Amotapos is up here. And what Karatseni is suggesting is that Hanopulo here corresponds to Herakleon, and the Piges Hanopoulou, the springs that are located in this vicinity, are the springs that are being referred to in the inscription. And this would make lovely sense because it's right in the middle of the area between Orion to the north and Ambrakia to the south. So Piges Hanopoulou corresponds to the hot springs associated with Heracles, supplying the toponym Heraclea, and traces of a tower, much overgrown now, unfortunately, can still be seen, which she identifies as the Heracleion Furion. The hot springs are located here, are shot here, excuse me, and they're in the basement of a hotel on that road just around here. So the reconstruction then of the important part of the inscription would be hosta emen horiatas ambrakiotais kai charadretais kai apometrathentos plethru apotas gonias tas protas tu techius tu fruriu, a plethron having been measured from the first corner of the wall of the garrison, not Ambrakia, but this midpoint between the two towns. Meta tas pagas tas Herakleas eis to pot horeon meros, and then from the Heraclean spring facing the section towards Oreon, kai tethentos terminos apotutu tu terminos, kateuthu epitas pagas tu afu, and after a termon has been placed here, from this termon straight on to the springs of the Aphas. Tas potoreon kai palinapotas gonias tas anotutachius tu fruriu apometrathentos plethru, and a little further on we read, again, from the other corners of the wall facing uphill, along the whole length of the wall, or perhaps parallel to the wall might be better, once a termon has been placed, from this termon straight on to the hill, the top of the hill called Kalla. The point of this is that in this reading, there was a frurion in the midsection of the area between Oreon and Ambrakia, with lines measured and termines fixed at points beginning from the garrison tower and running through the area where hot springs and the source of the Aphas River provided natural markers, and where the wall facing the crest of the hill behind helped to mark the boundary between Oreon and Ambrakia. In the remaining section of the plain, excuse me, no further delineation was needed because the boundary was provided by the river Aphas. Now, the attractiveness of this reconstruction of the terms of the agreement lies in the fact that the division of the Arta plain thus delineated in the inscription corresponds to the observable features, both natural and man-made, in the district. We can go a little further. The stipulation continues from the border between the Oraites and the Ambrakiots. All of the places in the direction of Ambrakia shall belong to the Ambrakiots, and from ... including the Herakleon and the fortress in it ... from Heraclea in the direction of Ambrakia shall all belong to the Ambrakiots. That's all the area to the south here of the line that we're talking about. The Piges are located here, and here's Hanopulo. The river shall be shared, and the places to the west of the shared border between the Ambrakiots ... in the direction alongside the fortress towards Oreon shall belong to the Charadrians. So we have a border line here, and it's also separating not only Oreon to the north from Ambrakia to the south, but also a town to the west, Charadros, from the Ambracian territory to the east. Consistent with Karatseni's suggestions, the border of Oreon and Ambrakia should divide the land into a northern zone under the control of Oreon, that's up here, and a southern zone belonging to Ambrakia, down here. Now, with the river as common to both. Now, normally in this region, when one thinks of a river, one thinks of either the Arachthos, which flowed directly past Ambrakia and was navigable to the Gulf, or the Luros, which rose from a spring much further west and also flowed down to the Gulf. But neither of these is meant because they don't flow between, Arion and Ambrakia. They aren't borders. I would suggest instead that the Afas River that divides the plain in two distinct zones can be identified as the river here. This riverbed running through the center of the plain. I hope you can see my cursor delineating this. The riverbed located there, which is now canalized. And so you can see, again, if I can get my cursor operating, here's the water channel here, but here's the ancient riverbed here. That's the Afas that's dividing the Orion section here from the Ambrakia section down here. As is demonstrated by line 29, Charadros, the other part of this inscription, lies further to the west, but the exact location of Charadros is contested. N.G.L. Hammond argued that the name Charadros, gorge, probably pointed to the gorge of the Luros River and offered Vuliasta as a site. You can see how it's located well to the northwest up here. On this plan, here's Vuliasta. Orion Amotapos is located here. Arta is here. So he would see the second party of this decree as being located well outside of this valley. On the other hand, and this was before the inscription that we have was known, of course, but Caban and Andreu preferred to identify Charadros with this, Filippiada, here, which seems to make good sense. It would mean the three places we're dealing with are Arta or Ambrakia here, Orion here, and Charadros Filippiada here. A town memorably described by Hammond as fly-blown and squalid. If Caban and Andreu are right, one might be tempted to interpret the boundary inscription as an attempt to divide the rich and fertile southern half of the plain of Arta equitably between two communities. Ambrakia on the east side of the plain, where proximity to the Arachthos River nurtured its control of trade to and from the hinterland towards Yanina, and Charadros Filippiada on the west side, profiting from its control of the gorges running northwest into Epiros, all the while taking into account the presence of a significant third party, Orion. Here again is Ambrakia nestled in a bend of the Arachthos, well situated for shipping goods up and down the river. This all makes good sense, but the inscription contains a good deal more. First, at line 38, we read of the involvement of Roman magistrates, archas Romaicas, and in the next line a reference to control of the land, kurieian tas horas. Although the inscription is broken at this point, the reference to Roman magistrates signals that this is no longer a purely local arbitration, but one that has taken into consideration the involvement of the Roman authorities. Now, we know that there are delegates from the two towns, Charadros and Ambrakia, who are working out the border on the ground, but it seems as if the whole deliberation is then going to be referred on to Roman magistrates, I would argue, for it to be authenticated and accepted. This becomes more significant, I would suggest, in the subsequent lengthy stipulations concerning land leasing. In section B, after a badly damaged 10 lines, we read this. As is written above, the Ambratiates shall possess, according to the written terms, the produce of the territory which they hold. The Charadrians shall be allowed to rent out their own land to foreigners who have a treaty with the Ambratiates and the Oraites, but to no one else. If not, they shall pay 10 talents to the city of Ambrakia when the Ambratiates exact the fine as written above. Similarly, the Ambratiates shall be allowed to rent out their land to those who have a treaty with the Charadrians and the Oraites, but to no one else. Otherwise, they shall be liable to pay 10 talents of silver to the Charadrians, when the Charadrians exact the fine, as is written above. And neither the Ambratiates nor the Charadrians shall be able to lay claim to any other part of the land under any pretext, but they shall remain within the boundaries that are recorded in the document and indicated by the stones. And if either of them does not abide by the terms, those who do not abide by the terms shall be liable to pay 30 talents to those who do abide by the terms, when those who abide by the terms exact the fine from those who do not abide by the terms, as is written above. In part, these detailed penalty clauses concern direct violations. Each side is to stay inside its boundaries. But the mention of foreigners here is striking, not renting the land out to any foreigners who don't already have treaties. Reciprocally, both sides agree that they can only rent to a third party who already has an existing treaty with the other party. Now, to some degree, this stipulation reflects a general anxiety focused on foreigners. But as Jason Koenig has emphasized recently in his discussion of Dio's Euboean discourse, the quote-unquote foreigner could be just about anyone whom the city dweller felt was unfairly exploiting the city's land and resources. This gentleman, says his speaker, is the men who profit from public land. They use our mountains as grazing land, and they farm and hunt, and they've built many houses, and they've planted vines, and they have many other advantages, despite the fact that they have paid nothing to anyone for the land, nor have they received it as a gift from the people. And later, Dio's city councillor will elaborate on these parasites, claiming that their people have seized almost all the land in the mountains. As in the remarkable story of the runaway slave community on Chios, where the Chians are forced to negotiate with Drimakos and the runaway slaves living in the hills, the Ambratiates were wary of an influx of foreigners into their region. Yet the stipulation in their agreement with the people of Charadros sought to regulate rentals within the territory of, just need to check with with the territory of Haradra, not Ambracia. I'll read that again. The stipulation in their agreement with the people of Charadros sought to regulate rentals within the territory of Charadros, not Ambracia. Under what circumstances would the Ambratiates, or any other state for that matter, feel an urgent need to regulate the disposition of land in another state's territory? The answer, I would suggest, is when the first community felt under threat. If its own autonomy was imperiled, it needed not only a detailed border agreement, but even an agreed-upon set of regulations about the disposition of all land in the vicinity. To clarify this and to understand the context in which the Ambratiot land agreement was made, we have to examine conditions in the region north of the Gulf of Ambracia in the 2nd century. Various scholars have drawn attention to the unsettled conditions in western Greece following the defeat of Perseus, and at the risk of rehashing data well known to many of you, I want to draw attention to the miserable conditions that Ambracia faced, and to show how vulnerable Ambracia was in the 160s. This, I think, will shed light on how local communities responded to events often beyond their control. To begin with, in the years before war with Perseus, the Ambratiates had repeatedly attempted to assert their autonomy. In the 4th century, they received Theodokoi and were listed separately from the neighbouring Molossians. Around 340 BC, they were part of a Corinthian allied force that celebrated the defeat of the Carthaginians in Sicily. And in the peace treaty signed by the Greeks with Philip II in 338/7, Ambracia appears alongside Phocians, Locrians, and Perrhaebians. That is, they were listed as their own autonomous polis, besides and separate from the federal and tribal states of central and western Greece. But in the 2nd century, they suffered heavily. The city was a supply base for Flamininus in 198 BC, an experience that was sufficiently distasteful to lead them to join the Aetolians. An Ambratiot named Alipos was among the ambassadors sent by the Aetolians, quote, to deprecate the anger of the Romans, as Polybius described their mission, to no avail. And Ambracia was sacked by the Roman army of Fulvius Nobilior in 189 BC. The Ambraciots then faced the further humiliation of watching Fulvius Nobilior and Aemilius Paulus argue before the Senate whether the city had been rightfully sacked as an enemy state, allowing the victor, Glabrio, to argue for a triumph, or had surrendered and had been shamefully plundered by Glabrio's men, as argued by Glabrio's fellow consul and sworn enemy Paulus. Despite the testimony of the Ambratiot ambassadors that they were loyal and that the sack had been unlawful, Glabrio got his triumph. Nothing more dramatically could have illustrated the weakness of the Ambraciots. Their autonomy was a victim of the rivalries of elite Romans. By the time of the Third Macedonian War, from 171 to 168, Ambratia's position was even more tenuous. Strabo's reference to the disobedience of, quote, the city associated with Pyrrhus suggests Ambracia was aligned with Epirus and the Molossians against Rome. Polybius Book 30 paints a vivid picture of the unrest that unfolded, commenting on Molossian statesmen opposed to Rome who all died bravely. At the end of the war, the defeat of Perseus precipitated a rush throughout central and northern Greece on the part of the many states who had aligned with the Macedonian king to placate the victors. The Acarnanian general Chremas rushed to Rome, one of a slew of congratulatory embassies from Achaia, Boeotia, Acarnania, Epirus, and Aetolia. The 10 legates appointed by the Senate attempted to impose some order on this chaos, on this chaotic situation, deciding which states should send embassies to Rome. And it is telling that in Polybius's list of ambassadors from central Greece, and in the dispositions decided by the Roman legates, there is no mention of Ambracia. And yet the defeat of Perseus had struck very close to home. Aemilius Paulus destroyed 70 cities in Epirus, most of them Molossian, and sold into slavery 150,000 people. If Polybius and Livy are to be trusted, the chaos afflicting the region completely surrounded Ambracia. For close to a decade, Lyciscus the Aetolian stirred up strife throughout the region. Mnassippos in Boeotia, Cremas in Acarnania, Harops of Epiros all ruled virtually unchallenged for 10 years. The decision of Lucius Anicius and Lucius Aemilius to put some of the notables to death and to transport others to Rome had released Harops and the other local big men to steal and plunder. In the 160s then, Ambracia, the Ambraciots were surrounded by hostile neighbors. They had a history of bad relations with Rome, and they were utterly vulnerable. The punishments exacted by Rome had seen the city sacked in 189, and in 169 they had watched Rome devastate Molosia and Epirus on their doorstep. They were justifiably terrified. In this context, the somewhat innocuous treaty with Charadros assumes a much greater significance. At this time, the Ambraciots were engaged in furious attempts to settle all of their borders, and to do so with Roman approval. SEG 3451 preserves a letter from Publius Cornelius Blasio requiring the Kerkyrians to settle a border dispute between Ambracia and the Athemanians, the people living to the east of Ambracia. The dispute had been referred to Rome by the two sides, and the Senate had sent the matter back to the praetor. The use of a third party to arbitrate was of course regular, but it's noticeable that the Ambraciots had sought to involve Rome, seeking Roman approval and Roman endorsement. A second document pertaining to Ambratia's borders dates to the same critical period, around 166 BC, and it was in this year that the Ambratiates sought a settlement of their border with the Acarnanians to the southwest, at that time under the control of their general Chremas, about whom Polybius was so openly critical. In this instance, the case was to be adjudicated by a group of Athenian ambassadors. In short, during a period of profound upheaval, with serious depopulation and widespread civil violence, the people of Ambracia undertook a series of negotiations with their neighbours, east and west, drawing in major outside authorities such as Athens and Rome to confirm their boundaries. They also even turned to other regional players, requesting financial support from the Thessalians, which in fact was given. Aside from the general chaos, violence, and lawlessness that afflicted the region after 168, the situation in Ambracia was especially dire. We've noted that Paulus destroyed 70 cities in Epirus and enslaved 150,000 people. Among the Epirates, the Molossians were hardest hit. The southernmost Molossian city was Oreon, here shown on the map in the middle as Amotapos. So the devastation that followed the defeat of Perseus extended to within 20 kilometers of Ambracia. As I've tried to show you with this Google map, you can walk from Oreon to Ambracia in under 4 hours. The only thing that stood between Ambracia and annihilation was a very clearly demarked boundary approved by the Romans. It was a matter of life and death that Ambracia should be able to show that Oreon's territory did not extend as far as Ambracia, and that a border treaty with another community nearby, Charadros, did not in any way, shape, or form constitute a threat to the newly decided arrangements for Western Greece overseen by Rome's legates. This was not just a matter of advertising the independence of Ambracia. In addition to cities destroyed, populations enslaved, we have to add refugees. Now, whether any such people could demonstrate that they were from communities bound by treaty to the Charadrians or Ambraciots is difficult to say, and these clauses might be equivalent to telling a refugee that without papers they have no right of entry, but a scenario does present itself. The Ambraciots, we have seen, tried to negotiate a border with the Athenians and the Acarnanians. The koinon of the Athenians did not survive the Roman rearrangement of Greek affairs around 165, and the Acarnanians too lost territory after the defeat of Perseus. Is it too much to suggest that our border treaty is the Ambraciot response to their powerlessness in the face of these Roman power plays? Ostensibly addressing the orderly division of the plain of Arta, it is also an attempt to demonstrate that Ambracia did not need or deserve direct Roman intervention. If this is correct, then we can understand why the decree had such an elaborate set of stipulations. Officers have made their report. Each of the cities shall inscribe this document also on steles, and each of them shall set up the steles in the customary temples. Similarly, each of the cities shall send envoys to carry the document which the border officers have jointly composed, to Elis and Larissa. And the envoys who are sent shall place bronze steles in the temple of Olympian Zeus in Elis, and the temple of Apollo Keradoios at Larissa, inscribed with the same words as the steles in Ambracia and in Charadros. Similarly, they shall deposit copies in the archive office of the cities, and the city of Ambracia shall give money for the expense of the steles and the inscriptions. The stelae and the archival copies use regional and international centers, Larissa and Olympia, to make Ambracia's existence a legal and bureaucratic reality at precisely a time when the actual existence of the polis and every community throughout Western Greece was in fact in doubt. The mechanisms of Greek diplomacy couldn't defeat a Roman legion, but they did provide a way of a community surviving. There remains, however, the question of what the Romans, either in the Senate in Rome or on the ground in Greece, understood was being decided. Valentina Casella has recently explored boundary disputes involving Romans in the world of Greece in the 2nd century and has emphasized that terms such as termini and terminatio had a strong ritual valence that rendered boundary stones powerfully significant. She identifies as the greatest innovation introduced to the Greek interpolis arbitral model a Roman practice whereby, namely, the identification of a temporal terminus as a resolutive element identifying the successful petitioner in a boundary dispute, which generally suggested the confirmation of authoritative demarcations existing prior to the start of the controversy. In this respect, I think it's noticeable that while the Ambrakia description does refer to horia, borders, the preferred term for the markers is not horoi, but termones, the Greek equivalent of termini, and that the officials responsible are referred to as termastai, a term otherwise unknown in Greek and etymologically closer to Latin, termini, terminarius, terminator. Lexically, the Ambrakia inscription reads like a blend of Greek and Latin concepts and language, and points towards the shadow of Rome, or at least Roman magistrates, over the procedure whereby the boundary was settled. In this respect, it may be worth looking at the Ambrakia Charadros border agreement as a settlement influenced by the Roman procedure of arbitratus. In a detailed study of Rome as an arbiter within border disputes in Italic territory, Maria Federica Petraccia has reached conclusions that fit the Ambrakiot situation perfectly. She notes that such arbitrations allowed Italic communities some degree of political and administrative autonomy, summed up in the legal expression sui legibus uti, and which resulted in a status halfway between independence and subjection. In disputes between states under what she calls the protective mantle of Rome, Rome would be legally designated to settle the disputes, and no other powers could be called upon without this infringing on Roman hegemony. The Ambrakiot settlement illustrates the legal principle of suis legibus uti in action, while the explicit inclusion of the Roman magistrates is in accordance with Petraccia's observation that the arbitrating judges in all such disputes in Italy were Roman. It seems that the Ambrakiots may have recognized that such a legal procedure, if applied to them, might even work to their benefit, guaranteeing their legal autonomy under the penumbra of Roman suzerainty. Approached as an example of Roman arbitration, or rather as a Greek response to the arbitratus, the Ambrakia Charadros agreement reveals powerful and suggestive similarities to existing Roman arbitrations such as the Tavola di Polcevera from Genoa. Dating to 117 BC, the tablet is far too long to reproduce or translate in its entirety here, and so I'm going to confine myself to observing similarities between this tablet and the Ambrakiot agreement before commenting on the significance of these. First, the Roman magistrates in the Genoese case offer a full description of their role. Quintus Minucius Rufus and Marcus Minucius Rufus inquired on the spot into the quarrels between the Genoans and the Veturians, and in their hearing settled the quarrels between them, and informed them of the conditions on which they were to hold their land, and of the conditions on which they would, to hold their land, and of the conditions on which boundaries were to be fixed. They ordered them to fix the boundaries and to cause boundary markers, termini, to be set up. This is virtually the exact procedure we see at work in the Ambrakia Charadros agreement, strongly suggesting that the Ambratiates were scrupulously speaking in terms that the Romans would understand. There follows in the Polcevera tablet the stipulation that the litigants travel to Rome once the boundaries had been fixed, which may have been a requirement imposed in the Greek case, although the publication of the settlement in various Greek sanctuaries may have allowed the Greeks to avoid reporting to the Senate. In the Polcevera tablet, there then follows a lengthy and detailed description of a linear boundary according to the customary usage of watercourses marked by termini. Ibe terminus stat proptuiam postum de alter transuiam postumiam terminus stat. Setting boundary markers is, of course, a natural consequence of adjudicating a boundary line, but it is notable that the language of the Ambrakiot Charadron agreement is much closer to the Roman determination, where horoi often marked the boundary between, say, sacred and profane land, or even hypothecated land. Here we are talking of boundary markers placed in the landscape to complement or supplement natural features. In the Polcevera tablet, this produces descriptions like, thence downhill straight along the ridge to the stream Vera Glaska, at the foot of Mount Berigiema, there a boundary marker stands. Thence uphill straight along up the ridge to Mount Prenicus, there a boundary marker stands. Thence downhill straight down the ridge to the stream Tulislaska, there a boundary marker stands, and so forth. If we ask which practice is reflected in the Ambrakia plain, horostones or termini, the answer is revealing. Roman cadastration and land measurement looks more in evidence here, resulting not in horoi, but in termones. Termon, incidentally, turns up in Greek inscriptions from Sicily and Magna Graecia. It is not used in Ionia. Following the border delineation in the Polcevera tablet, the next section lists a series of penalty clauses with an emphasis on restricting access to the land to those with a legitimate claim. Within the said land, no one must possess a holding unless it be by a majority vote of the Lagensian Veturii, and on condition that he admits no one onto his holding for the purpose of tilling, unless he be a Genuine or a Veturian. Once again, the third party, the foreigner, is a threat that must be conceptually handled if the agreement is to be effective. Now, none of the observations I've thrown out for consideration proves definitively that the Ambrakiot settlement is to be classified as a Roman arbitratus. And indeed, there are counter-arguments against reading this as a Roman arbitration. Julian Schneider, for example, and Julian's here, we can talk about this later, has pointed out to me, per epistolas, that if a third party was acting as a judicial authority, this usually would have been declared at the very beginning of such a document, which is not the case here. Certainly the Greeks of Western Central Greece did not need a sententia manuciorum in order to establish boundaries. Greek states had been doing this for centuries. But the presence of a power that was frequently hostile and which had repeatedly intervened violently in the region did increase the pressure on the Ambratiates and their neighbours to proceed very carefully. By adopting Roman practices and producing a border which was not only linear but measured, establishing termini at points in the landscape to mark transitions from one topographic zone, such as the plain, to another, such as the ridge, and seeking the endorsement of Roman officials, has the overall effect, it seems to me, of eliding the difference between a Greek land settlement and a Roman arbitratus. In doing so, the Ambratiads demonstrated that they too could adapt to Rome's presence, no doubt in the hope that they would not merely survive, but perhaps even be nourished by the stability that Rome brought. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this wonderful talk and rich talk, and also for summarizing some of the results of some past FeBinars and going a step further. I think there will be a lot of questions, and so floor is open for debate.
Right.
Okay. But we can share it again if we need to go into.
Oh, if you want me to, I can open it up again.
No,
I just
it's okay. Okay.
Okay.
Sebastian, and then Professor Antonetti. Sebastian Scharf, please.
Thank you, Elena. First of all, thank a lot to you, Jeremy, for this for this wonderful and stimulating talk about a subject I'm interested in myself as well.
Mm-hmm.
I have two questions. The first is about what you said at the end. Probably one could argue also from that last argument you made. So not so much stress the danger the Ambratians were in, but the chance they had now.
Yes.
Because they lived in a world, they lived in the border zone of a lot of great states around them before. Large great Greek states, like there were Epirotean interests, Aetolian interests in Ambracia. So this might also be a chance for the Ambratians when Rome came. So they had, in a way, they had to deal with one superpower, but only with one. So this would be another way to put it in a way. And just a little point regarding what you said about Termon and this. I'm not so sure if one should stress this so much, because if I look at the Peloponnese, we have not Thermas Tai, but we have Thermas Teres in an arbitration between Corinth and between the Corinthians and the Epidaurians from Epidaurus. So, and we have other vocabulary close to that. So this is just something I wanted to add. But thank you a lot for this wonderful talk and the very stimulating ideas you presented.
Thanks. I love the idea that this is an opportunity for the Ambratians. They need a positive outlook after the suffering that they've gone through in the past. And on the terminology, I'm well aware that there are cognates that are found in the Peloponnese. The major point really is that it doesn't occur anywhere in East Greece at all, and that termastai is a hapax. So yeah, it's from the same lexical field, but it is a tiny bit different, and that really caught my eye. But thank you. You're absolutely right. Yes.
Thank you. I think Professor Antonetti wanted to ask a question.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Hi, Jeremy. And thank you a lot for this wonderful talk, and also for the idea that we must say the last phases of this Greek history maybe as an opportunity, and so a game between the with Rome and with the others. It's a good idea, but because in fact all these boundaries, treaties, all these regulations about Ambracia are so important, but so in the same period, in the same Roman period, which in fact it's a relevant issue. But I have, as Sebastian said, a reflection about the terminology. This termones, termasteres is a big question, I think, and I think Fritz Schnitzer was right when he wrote that this terminology is particularly frequent in this Northwest Greece. And I found many of these termines, which in fact are borders between communities. And there are different levels of communities. There are borders in the north of Aetolia, in these no man lands, Ternon, Eitaion, Eoitanon, so small communities of maybe of the Euritanes, other who are named Arusaion, Menaion, so community of the north, and then single Termon, so the Horus himself, which comes from Stratos, so north of Stratos, which is always very interesting. All this, so no known territory, and another one is published now in the second volume of our collection of Greek inscription from Syria, and it comes from Syrian. But the question is that the most ancient of these testimonies are of the 3rd century BC, as in the well-known treaty about Aetolians and Acarnanians. In this one, we have the verb, but yeah, and it is about the Pras, which is the enclave, once again, north of Stratos. I suspect that this terminology and is also known outside, but is particularly frequent in this area, so wide area. It was maybe known, maybe more ancient than the Roman times, but we can also suspect some crossing, some how to say, an intentionally use of a recognition of a term, a lexicon, which is a big question, because I remember many years ago that the same things appear with the ancient Venetia, the Veneti, which have the same word. I suspect that there is it's a big question, I think.
Yeah.
Because of the god Terminus in the Latin religion and the Roman religion and so on. But we can also suspect, so to say, reactivation and use which was recognized by the Romans, but in fact it was ancient. So it's complicated. I have no answer, but it's
I totally agree, and thank you very much for fleshing that out. That makes me want to be much more cautious about any claims that I make, along the lines of what Sebastian was pointing out as well. There is something going on with the terminology that's very interesting. I'm not sure that we've cracked it at all, but these comparanda will be very useful for me. Thank you very much. I really appreciate what you say.
hope to see you soon. Ciao.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I've been an admirer of your work for so long. It's
Yeah.
I'm just glad that you're not tearing strips off it completely. So thank you. Thank you very much.
Ciao, thank you.
Ciao.
Ciao.
Any other questions or remarks? Oh, yes. Julian Gabriel Schneider, please ask your question.
Hello, Jeremy.
Hi, Julian.
So good to see you, at least
It's nice to meet you
virtually.
properly, sort of.
And thank you so much for this very interesting paper. I'm really fascinated how you combine epigraphical evidence with topographical evidence and arguments. It made perfectly sense for me. I have a question about the second partner in this agreement, Charadros. You focused mainly on Ambrakia in your discussion of the Roman involvement or the fear of involving the Romans in local problems, let's say. And I was wondering, since both cities or communities are engaged together in this agreement, were they actually sitting in the same boat and kind of agreeing to this boundary settlement, or to the, let's say, demarcation of the boundary, to team up against Roman involvement? Or how can we read the Charadros part of this agreement? Because formally speaking, I just went through the last part of the text as well, and they even have to share the costs for the boundaries, for the erection of the stelae. So both were equally involved in this agreement. And what does this tell us about Charadros?
Yeah, those are great questions, and I'm going to give you very unsatisfactory answers. I think one of the few secure points that we can make is that Charadros must be the much smaller site of the two, just based on the fact that where you have 25 delegates from Ambrakia, you only have 10 from there. There's very little known about it. You might remember there is a mention, I think it's in Polybius, of ambassadors on their way to Rome being captured and actually being deposited back at Charadros. And I've sometimes wondered, does that mean that Charadros is actually a place where there might even be a Roman garrison? I don't know. I don't know. But I think of it as being sort of a satellite town, much as Filipiada is today to Arta. But if you want to define the east and the western side of the plain, that becomes the major driving force behind the border inscription, whereas in fact the people, I think, in Ambrakia are actually much more concerned about Oreon and the border with Malosia and that area. So I actually think what's happening is you're getting two different sets of influences shaping what goes into the inscription. But I mean, we don't even know exactly whether Charadros is Filipiada. That's a best guess. I'm sorry, I don't think that's a very satisfactory answer.
No, it's just that we know so little about it, but it's intriguing because if we put also the second town in this broader picture that you draw, it might be also interesting for hypothesis on this other side, on this other party of the agreement.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay,
I
thank you so
agree.
much.
And by the way, in my notes, I have written many times Charadra, obviously gorge, rather than Charadros. So if I was slipping between the two toponyms, I apologize for any confusion I may have caused. The town is Charadros. But thank you. Thanks, Julian.
And maybe if I can ask another question, a follow-up question. Maybe it's just a wild guess. The problem of foreigners in the border delineation could be also a legal one, because it would be very hard for the opposite town to get them to court or to actually pursue any violation of the border. Whereas if it was a citizen of the other one, by the symbol on, they could sue them much more easier. So maybe there is also a very practical, in a very practical sense, that it would be much more difficult to pursue transgressions or violations in a legal
Absolutely.
sense. Yeah.
Absolutely. But I just, here I'm just using imagination, but I can't help feeling that as 150,000 people are being siphoned out of Epirus to Rome, there must be some who tried to go in the opposite direction. And one of the first places that you could go would be down past Amotapos and into the Ambracian plain. So I actually rather suspect there really was a concrete issue of just refugee bodies. And the legal complications absolutely merely compound that. I think you're absolutely right.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thanks. Thanks.
Any more questions or remarks here in the room or online? Just raise your hand, ask your question live, or you can also write in the chat. So in that case, I take advantage of my position and ask a question myself. Do we have evidence about previous border regulations in this area, or can we go so far to say that it is conflict which triggers the need for border negotiation and border linearity?
That is a very good question. I'm not familiar with there being regularly determined borders from earlier periods in this area. I have to say, and this is a theme that I think it will be relevant to FeBo, but I'm not quite sure how to tease it out. I've always been struck by the fact that Ambrakia is an anomaly, and it's in an anomalous position because around it you have federal bodies. The urban units tend to be incorporated into federal bodies. I'm not going to lecture this audience about that. Whereas Ambrakia is not. It's quite isolated. And I was thinking about this in particularly in relation to the fabulous Polyandrion and the inscription from that, which I've been working on for a different project. This is a town which is extremely isolated in terms of the communities with whom it can affiliate. And it seems to assert the strongest affiliation, in fact, with Corinth. So I think this is why in the 2nd century there is this strong urge to establish firm borders with these other legal entities. But before that, I think it's rather elastic in terms of relationships between the Ambratiates and the people out in the hinterland who might be Greek or who might be Epirot or who might not be Greek. I don't know. So I don't think that's an answer to your question, Eleanor, except to say I don't think there is a long tradition of forming borders up here, except, as Professor Antonetti was saying, between the various smaller communities, particularly in Italia.
Thank you very much,
Yeah.
because this is a topic we are working on, the connection, if there is a connection between the rise of linear borders and the urge to establish them in a very precise manner, as you showed us, for example, in some passages of this inscription, and there are many other cases on the one side, and on the other side, conflict, which in fact triggers the necessity for border negotiation. Of course, here isolation plays a significant role, and autonomy comes in as an important issue with regard to other players too. Thank you very much.
Sure. Thank you.
Any more questions? Well, in that case, again, I express my gratitude to Professor McInerney for this wonderful FeBinar and for people asking questions. We had a FeBinar within the FeBinar almost, so very interesting and stimulating debate, which will be very useful for us working on our issues in the framework of FeBo. Let me remind you our next FeBinar, which will take place on November the 20th. It will be devoted specifically in that case to borders and connections, more from an anthropological point of view, and it will be delivered by Francesco Remotti. So everyone is welcome, of course. Thank you again, and thank you, of course, to Professor McInerney. Can close the meeting. Thank you.
Ciao. Ciao.
Arrivederci. Grazie.
Arrivederci, grazie.